Today, Singapore looks almost impossible. A tiny island city-state in Southeast Asia, smaller than New York City. So land-starved it literally expanded itself into the sea. It has no oil, no vast farmland, no natural hinterland, and yet it became one of the richest countries on Earth. A country with hundreds of thousands of millionaires, one of the world's most powerful sovereign reserves, an education system ranked among the best globally. But this little red dot was not always the behemoth it is today.
Rising tensions between Malay and Chinese communities soon erupted into some of the worst unrest Singapore had seen. The violence spread beyond a single district, forcing curfews across the island. By the end, 23 people were dead and 454 were injured. Then, in September, the fear returned. After the killing of a Malay trishaw rider in Geylang Serai, rumors spread quickly, and another wave.
Singapore wasn't supposed to survive.
On this moment, when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia.
In 1965, this tiny island was suddenly kicked out of Malaysia. No resources to fall back on, no military powerful enough to defend itself, no certainty that this country would even survive. Even its drinking water depended on another country. And when Singapore's founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, announced the separation on live television, he started crying, because this wasn't a victory speech. It was the realization that Singapore might not survive at all. For Lee Kuan Yew, this was not independence. It was
a moment of anguish.
At the time, Singapore looked less like the future financial capital of Asia, and more like a failed experiment. A vulnerable island surrounded by larger neighbors. A city with racial tensions, unemployment, weak defenses, and almost no strategic depth. Many believed the country would collapse within years. Instead, this island, smaller than New York City, would become one of the richest and most strategically important places on Earth. One of the world's busiest ports, one of Asia's most important financial hubs, one of the strongest passports, a country so globally connected that the modern economy now quietly flows through it. So how did this happen? And what did Singapore understand about survival that most countries still don't? Because Singapore's success was never just about economics, it was about fear. And to understand that fear, we need to go back to one of the greatest military humiliations in British history.
To Britain, the fall of Singapore was almost unthinkable. This was the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress built to guard an empire, a symbol of power, permanence, and control. Then, in February 1942, it collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were trapped, civilians were left terrified, and the empire that had promised protection was suddenly forced to surrender. Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history.
But for Singapore, this was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological wound. One of the most powerful empires on Earth had promised security and failed when it mattered most. The lesson was brutal. No one was guaranteed to save you. No empire, no ally, no outside power. Years later, when Singapore became independent, that lesson still lingered. Dependence was dangerous. Dependence on foreign protection. Dependence on imported resources. Dependence on global stability. Singapore's survival could never rest entirely in someone else's hands, and that fear would shape almost everything. Its military, its economy, its schools, its housing, even the infrastructure hidden beneath the city. This was not a country built from abundance. It was a country built from vulnerability. And once you understand that, Singapore suddenly starts making a lot more sense. The strict laws, the anti-corruption obsession, the mandatory military service, the relentless efficiency, the long-term planning.
Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
That was not just political rhetoric. It was the psychology of a country that believed weakness could be fatal. Singapore was not trying to become loved. It was trying to become indispensable. And geography would become its first weapon. For centuries, global trade has flowed through one of the most important maritime corridors on Earth, the Strait of Malacca. Oil, food, electronics, manufactured goods. The bloodstream of global commerce moved through this narrow passage between East and West, and sitting near this route was Singapore. But geography alone does not create prosperity. Plenty of countries have strategic locations and still fail. Singapore's real breakthrough was understanding something deeper.
Singapore must keep engaging China.
United States-Singapore Joint Vision Statement on
In a global economy, trust is one of the most valuable resources on Earth. Businesses can tolerate taxes, they can tolerate rules, they can tolerate expensive labor. But uncertainty terrifies capital. So Singapore engineered itself to feel predictable. Corruption was punished. Contracts were enforced. Infrastructure improved. The port became faster, cleaner, and more reliable. In a region where businesses often feared instability, Singapore began to look almost unnatural. Orderly, efficient, controlled. A place where goods moved, money moved, and rules actually meant something. That reputation became an economic weapon. Foreign companies came for manufacturing, then logistics, then finance, then regional headquarters. Singapore was no longer just using its location, it was converting trust into money. Today, Singapore remains one of the world's busiest container transshipment hubs. It is connected to hundreds of ports around the world. A tiny island made itself hard to bypass. But Singapore's leaders understood something darker. A rich country that cannot defend itself is still vulnerable. In 1965, Singapore had almost no strategic depth. If danger came, there was nowhere to retreat. No vast interior, no mountains to hide behind, no huge population to absorb a disaster. So Singapore had to solve an impossible problem. It could never become large, but it could become costly to threaten. 2 years later, Lee Kuan Yew put that fear into words.
If you who are growing up do not understand that you've got to defend this, then I say, in the end we will lose. Other people will come, smack you down, take it over.
Starting 1967, national service is mandated for all Singaporean males. Every year, hundreds of young men like these put on military fatigues and begin their journey through military training. For the next 2.5 years, they would experience what it meant to become soldiers.
Just 2 years after independence, national service was introduced. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was popular, but because Singapore's leaders believed survival required deterrence. And Lee Kuan Yew had another way of describing it. In a world of big fish and small fish, Singapore had to become a poisonous shrimp. Small, but painful enough that a bigger power would think twice before swallowing it. The Singapore Armed Forces grew around readiness, technology, and constant preparation. Because in Singapore's worldview, peace was not something you simply hoped for. Peace had to be maintained by making danger expensive. And that same mindset reached far beyond the military. It reached underground, literally. Most people visiting Singapore never see the survival machine beneath the city. Under the polished skyline is a massive underground system built to collect and move used water across the island. The deep tunnel sewerage system. It helps Singapore transport used water for treatment and recycling, supporting the country's long-term water strategy. And this was not just an engineering project, it was vulnerability turned into infrastructure. For decades, Singapore depended heavily on imported water from Malaysia. And dependence is never just technical, it is political.
A few days after independence, the Prime Minister of Malaysia told the British High Commissioner, "If Singapore doesn't do what I want, I'll switch off the water supply."
If another country controls something you cannot live without, survival becomes negotiation. So Singapore built alternatives, reservoirs, desalination, new water, an underground water system so robust, Singapore seemed to have built a second city underground. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Singapore identifies a weakness, then builds a system to reduce dependence on it. And perhaps nowhere is that mindset more visible than housing. Today, close to 80% of Singapore's resident population lives in public housing. To many outsiders, that sounds almost impossible. But Singapore did not treat housing as a side issue. It treated housing as nation building. If citizens owned a stake in the country, they had something to protect. If communities were planned carefully, social tension could be managed before it exploded. Public housing became more than apartments. It became a system for stability, a way to organize land, families, transport, savings, race, and identity inside one national project. The same logic appeared in the Central Provident Fund. Savings became infrastructure. Through CPF, workers and employers contributed up to 37% of wages into a mandatory system designed to support housing, healthcare, and retirement. At first glance, this can feel restrictive, but Singapore's leaders prioritized long-term stability over short-term comfort. And this reveals something important about Singapore. The country was not built around maximum freedom. It was built around maximum resilience. But perhaps Singapore's most important investment of all was in its people.
This was a mud flat, swamp. Today, this is a modern city. 10 years from now, this will be a metropolis. Never fear. You know, some people think, oh, well, you know, we are a small place, they can put the screws on us. It's not so easy. We are a small place. In size, yes, geography. But in the quality of the men, the administration, the organization, the metal in a people, the fiber.
Without oil, without minerals, without vast farmland, Singapore had only one resource left: its people. And so human capital became national strategy. Education was no longer optional. Technical training expanded. Skills were upgraded again and again and again. Because if Singapore could not dig wealth from the ground, it would have to build it. And so the country climbed, from labor-intensive factories to electronics, from electronics to semiconductors, then aerospace, then biotech, then finance, always moving upward, never standing still. Until one of the smallest countries on Earth became one of the most advanced economies in the world. Many countries welcomed foreign investment. Singapore did something different. It studied it, learned from it, absorbed skills, transferred knowledge, used multinational corporations not only for jobs, but as ladders. And with every decade, Singapore embedded itself deeper into the global economy. Its port became one of the busiest on Earth. More than 44 million containers moved through Singapore in a single year. Its airport became one of the world's greatest transport hubs. In 2026, Changi was named the world's best airport for the 14th time. Piece by piece, the island became difficult to ignore. Changi Airport was never only about moving passengers, it was about relevance. The Port of Singapore was not merely infrastructure, it was leverage. The goal was simple: become too useful to bypass. Cargo ships stretch across the horizon. Aircraft move through Changi. Containers arrive from every corner of the planet. Nearly 70 million passengers traveled through the airport in a single year. An enormous flow of global movement compressed into a little red dot. Singapore was no longer surviving because it possessed resources. It was surviving because it became one. As China rose and America remained deeply influential in Asia, many countries faced pressure to choose sides. But Singapore approached geopolitics the same way it approached survival: pragmatically. It built deep economic ties with China. At the same time, it maintained strong strategic and military links with the United States.
The Singapore Navy is holding its largest Exercise Pacific Reach edition, bringing together some 600 naval forces from 17 nations.
American naval vessels operated through Singapore. Western banks and multinational corporations use Singapore as a trusted Asian base. Chinese capital, trade, and influence also became deeply connected to the island.
Trade patterns are changing, supply chains are being reconfigured, and technology is reshaping industries faster than ever. But even with all these, Singapore Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong says the island state's ties with China continues to strengthen.
Singapore did not seek power through size, it gained influence through relevance. Do not pretend to be stronger than you are. Do not become a pawn if you can become a platform.
Singapore also sealed its reputation for arbitration.
Singapore made itself stable enough, useful enough, and trusted enough that powerful countries preferred it alive. And this was the hidden pattern behind Singapore's rise. Every weakness became an incentive to adapt. Scarce land pushed the city upward. Water insecurity drove innovation. Military vulnerability made security a national priority. The lack of natural resources drove investment in its people, and a tiny domestic market forced Singapore to connect itself to the world. Singapore did not escape vulnerability. It organized itself around it. But success came with a cost, because the same system that made Singapore efficient also made everyday life intense. You can see it in the mornings. Trains fill before the sun has fully risen. Students move from school to tuition to exams that feel less like tests and more like verdicts on their future. Office workers cross the city with phones already in their hands. Messages arrive before the workday even begins. Deadlines follow them home long after it ends. This is what success can look like from the inside: safe, organized, world-class, but also fast, competitive, relentless. The education system became world famous, but childhood became more pressured. The economy became advanced, but work became more demanding. Housing gave families stability, but adulthood came with its own calculations: saving, planning, paying, keeping up. Singapore had optimized itself for survival, and slowly, Many Singaporeans began to feel they had to optimize themselves too. That is the uncomfortable side of the Singapore miracle. To some, Singapore became proof of what discipline, planning, and strong governance could achieve. A tiny island that turned vulnerability into strength. A poor nation that became one of the richest in the world. A city-state that made itself impossible to ignore. But to others, Singapore became something more unsettling. A warning that a society can become so efficient, so disciplined, so good at solving problems, that eventually everything begins to look like a problem. Land becomes something to optimize. Water becomes something to secure. Talent becomes something to produce. Risk becomes something to eliminate. Time becomes something to maximize. And life becomes something to manage. And maybe that is why Singapore is so difficult to describe, because it is not just a success story, it is what happens when survival becomes a system. The trains run on time, the lights stay on, the numbers improve, and still, another exam, another bill, another upgrade, another reason to keep moving. All of it was built by a country that never fully trusted luck. And that may be Singapore's greatest strength and its deepest burden.